What's really nice today is that we've got not just Eben with us, but we've got Raymond Moody with us. And in a moment I'll invite Ray up to start his talk. So we've had Eben, who's had first-hand amazing experience of the NDE, an amazing book. And now we've got one of the world experts on NDEs. So after Raymond's talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite Eben back up here with Raymond, and perhaps Professor Laszlo as well. And then I'm going to host just a brief question and answer session. I know there are people in the audience who've had profound NDEs themselves, or OBEs. And now is your chance to think about your questions that you want to ask these two people. One who's studied NDEs for many, many years and has got so many insights, and someone who's had an amazing NDE experience. So if you've got burning questions, you will get a chance to ask them all. And perhaps Irving can give us his thoughts on it as well. Okay, so it makes me a huge pleasure to welcome Raymond up here, who's going to address you on his life and work. Raymond.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for coming. It's good to see a lot of old friends here. And the theme of the conference today is infinite consciousness. And thanks for that theme, because I'll tell you the truth, I'd never really thought about that before. Even though I wrote several papers, philosophy papers on the concept of the infinite. But thinking about this conference, it struck me how odd it is that I had never thought of combining my interest in infinity with my interest in near-death experiences. So thanks for that. And I think it's neat the way Masami brought that to our attention so dramatically a while ago, talking about the infinity. And the question that arises here, you see, I think, is do near-death experiences tell us anything about infinity, which is a question I never thought of. And is there something in the near-death experience that we could describe as infinite consciousness? And as I got to thinking about it, I realized, yes, there is, very obviously. But first, I want to talk a little bit about infinity. Because, the Western notion of infinity was introduced by Anaximander, the Greek philosopher of roughly, say, 560 BC is the time you can think of Anaximander as living. And Anaximander came up with this notion that evolved into our notion that we call today infinity. And what is really interesting about it, which I got into it in graduate school, is there are actually not one, but two concepts of infinity. And it's very apropos to this topic we're addressing. And the first concept of infinity is the metaphysical theory of infinity, and concept of infinity as it's typically called. Or you might call the positive or actual theory of infinity, which tries to describe something, tries to describe infinity as something unitary. Here are some of the typical words that are associated with the metaphysical concept of infinity would be, for example, completeness, wholeness, universality, perfection, absoluteness, self-contained unity. And among the philosophers that are associated with this particular view of infinity are, at least by philosophers who are interested in this subject, this is not exactly my view, but I'll tell you the traditional view is that Descartes, for example, and Kant and Hegel espoused this perfection or unitary or metaphysical notion of infinity. But the other notion is mathematical infinity, which puts the notion in terms of negative traits, such as boundless, endless, unlimited, immeasurable, and so on. And this concept of infinity links it to potentiality. And this concept of infinity, as you'll know, if you study philosophy a little bit, is due to Aristotle, right? And he is the propounder of this mathematical or negative notion of infinity. And I think probably the type of infinity that we are interested in here today that is relevant to this sort of concern is more the metaphysical notion of infinity. And in papers I wrote in graduate school on this, I dismissed the notion of the absolute or the unitary or metaphysical notion of infinity as incoherent. But in thinking through this presentation, I got to realize, well, maybe I've changed my mind now, because what's come into my mind is I think there is an aspect of the near-death experience, which I never thought of before, which really does bring to the fore in a very real way this metaphysical notion of infinity. So, you know, really it's pointless almost now to say the general structure of a near-death experience, because everybody's heard this unless you've been hiding out in a cave in the Himalayas for the last 30 years. You know basically the pattern is that people say when their heart stops beating and so on, that they seem to leave their bodies, rise up above their bodies, to enter into a sort of passageway, and they go through this passageway, come out on the other side in an incredibly brilliant and warm and loving light in which they may encounter the spirits of deceased relatives and so on. And as this progresses, although progresses is not exactly the word we're forced to use the word progressive because language is sequential, right? But as I'm sure Evan or Pim or lots of people here will agree with me that, how should I put this, that world that Evan went to is not describable. That's one of the most common things that people say who've had near-death experiences, that it's ineffable. And timeless, that no time passes. But because language is sequential, when they relate this, they have to relate it as though it were a sequence. Although in the experiencing of it, it's not sequential. I'm on the right track here. I think this is what I hear from people with near-death experiences. But as this experience goes on, people will tell me that all of this that they've experienced, including the physical world, just kind of disappears. And they come to, or as though awake, into a timeless reality in which they see everything they've ever done. Although no time passes, they see very vividly every single event of their lives in detail. And when they do this, people will tell me that when you see your life reviewed in this panorama, you don't see yourself, you don't see the action from the point of view you had when you were doing each action. But rather your consciousness is displaced and you view every single thing you've ever done through the eyes and sensations and feelings of the person with whom you've interacted. And this is, I can't sort of standard knowledge about this. It's a very common element of near-death experiences. Now, my interest in this has never been from a religious basis. I really had essentially zero religious interest or background when I was a kid, and still that's true. I'm interested in religion as a phenomenon, but I'm not religious. As I like to say, I talk to God every day, and He's never said a word to me about religion. And so to me, this is very counterintuitive, this whole thing. And as a logician, I've just developed over the years my own philosophy and procedure, and that is that I will do anything to avoid drawing a conclusion. And because, it's fascinating to me that so many people, the way they use reasoning is they have this thing out there that they think they know or that they believe, and they create some sort of, argument to sort of support it. And I think that must be a terrible way to feel inside. I mean, what a desperate maneuver, and really, I think, kind of irrational. Because I don't think that people who approach it that way can be having very much fun. Because I know from my experience that the fun of logic is not trying to use it to flimsily establish what you already think you know. But to me, the great fun of logic is to apply it to see what is. I don't want to know that. I want to know whether. That's a very important distinction. But a lot of people kind of want to know that, right? And so they rush drastically to the conclusions, scientific evidence of life after death, so on. And that's totally misleading. Now, in terms of Evan, I acknowledge entirely, as he and I have talked about many times, I acknowledge that from his point of view, yes, I'm convinced that Evan kind of knows that there's life after death. That much I know. But in terms of my process, I give up. Okay? And so I always like to draw the minimal conclusion I can about anything. Because it's safer and it's more fun. Because you're applying logic the proper way. And in thinking about that, I think that there is a very startling conclusion that we can draw from these panoramic life reviews. A very startling conclusion that we can assure ourselves, as a matter of certainty, we can draw a conclusion. Now, first, we have to set aside the whole notion of an afterlife for a moment. All right, let's just take that out of our thinking. What can we infer with certainty from these life reviews? And what I'm going to propose to you as a certainty we can infer is very startling. And that is that at least for some of us, life is a two-phase process. Think about that for a moment. Apparently, many of us lead life forward as the actor or protagonist. Then we do this 180-degree turnaround, and we review identically the same action from the point of view of the other characters. And I think that is a certainty. If somebody could show me a reason why that's not true, I'd appreciate to hear it, because what I'm interested in is what is. But it looks to me like we can say with certainty that life is a two-phase process. We lead it forward as the actor or protagonist, then we go through a turnaround, and then we re-witness the same things through the thoughts and ideas and feelings of those with whom we've interacted. Incidentally, that raises the question to me is whether, therefore, people like Evan, who've had a near-death experience, are now in a third phase of life, right? Because he's been through that in a way, or lots of people with near-death experiences have been through that, and now they're back here. And it really, when I got to thinking about this a few years ago, it really hit me like a ton of bricks, as we say, about Heraclitus, because Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher, is one of my favorites of the pre-Socratics. And Heraclitus and a lot of these early Greek philosophers, actually, were very fascinated with these stories of near-death experiences. And Heraclitus was one of them. And by the way, the word that's often used for this is revenant. If you look into classical literature, and I have Christian here who's more of an expert on this than I am, but it seems to me that the way this is translated is the word revenant. And if you look that up, it means a person who's died and come back, essentially. And what Heraclitus said was that the revenant is appointed to watch over the living and the dead. And that's a rather startling thought, too. We have among us these sort of intermediary beings that I've been so privileged to know literally thousands of them. And it's one of the highlights of my life. And revenants, or people who are kind of midway, their access to this world and to the other world. So it's really interesting, I think, then in the last few decades that this information, which was known to the ancient Greeks, but you know, the ancient Greeks didn't have many cases to investigate. I mean, they had some, and the ones they knew of were very powerful. And but now the situation has changed very dramatically, whereas the most modern medical technology and techniques has reintroduced this ancient problem of life after death into the midst of modern medical practice. By the way, a book that Evan and I contributed to, which is coming out soon, next month I think, is by the University of Missouri Press. And I want to tell you about this. It's called The Science of Near-Death Experiences. And in my opinion, this is going to be the new gold standard. Forget all of the books that Pam has contributed to. Forget all the other previous books, because this book goes into the medical, the psychological, the philosophical, the clinical, has it all covered. It's an excellent book. And apparently I've already made arrangements with one person. Maybe we can get this published in Germany. And so we've waken up in a really dramatic way in modern society to this phenomenon that so fascinated the ancient Greeks. And I think that the most important or the most exciting thing about this whole notion of an afterlife and the investigation of it and the prospect of rational proof or rational enlightenment on the afterlife questions is that in order to process this question, it's not enough to use the mind we have and the logic we have. One of my favorite philosophers was David Hume. And for those who don't know of him, David Hume was one of the founders of what we call the scientific mind. He lived from 1711 to 1776. And he investigated the concept of causation and some difficulties about the inductive logic that is involved in science. And Hume is kind of the archetype of the skeptic in the modern world. And this is what Hume said about the prospect of proving the afterlife. He said, and if you'll follow these words along with me in your mind as I say them, I think you'll see how obviously true it is. Hume had this great way of very eloquently stating problem in such a way that if you think along with him, you say, well, yes. And what he said was, by the mere light of reason, it seems difficult to prove the immortality of the soul. He said, some new species of logic is requisite for that purpose, and some new faculties of the mind, that they may enable us to comprehend that logic. Well, you know, that's absolutely true, because just to basically state this, the statement that there is an afterlife does not accord with the Aristotelian logic that we're using right now. And I could go into details, but one way of saying it bluntly is that the sentence, there is life after death, if you look up the meanings in the dictionary, that's a self-contradiction. Because death just means the final irreversible cessation of life. So if you say, there is life after death, you're saying, there is life after the final irreversible cessation of life. And that's not, you know, a contradiction. But if you have the sort of model of looking into the afterlife, like I sort of subscribe to, then I want to know whether, right? And I want to know what process you could go to get some enlightenment of this. And if that is your take on it, I think Hume is the person you need to reflect on. If the idea is just to throw up some arguments that seem to support it, something that we already believe, that won't be the tack we would take. But to me, the Hume point of view on this is much more exciting than what we have now, the idea that we can use the current methods of rational investigation as a way of probing into the afterlife. And that's not going to work. I mean, if you look at the history of this, it doesn't work. But a lot of people have always assumed that when Hume made that remark, he was being ironical, and that really what he meant was it's impossible. Right? But whatever he meant, whether he meant that it was impossible or not, the fact is he came up with the right criterion if you think it through logically. And also I think that Hume's condition can completely be satisfied. I'm absolutely confident that it can. That we have entirely new means of investigating this question of life after death. Incidentally, now that I've talked a while, if you don't mind, I want to be impolite and take off my coat. This is a little bit different heat than I am accustomed to.
Would you repeat the quote of Hume? You said
Yes.
by the mirror of...
Yes, by the mere light of reason.
Oh, the mere light.
The mere, M-E-R-E, light of reason, it seems difficult to prove the immortality of the soul. Some new species of logic is requisite for that purpose, and some new faculties of the mind. Where my work has actually been going for a long time on this is that I am convinced that we can equip with people with an entirely new set of rational principles, and not with the aim of, anything to do with the afterlife or near-death experiences, but for the two simple objectives. Number one, to impart a new system of rational principles, and number two, to open up new faculties of the mind that we didn't know we had. That is remarkably simple to do, actually. I mean, it seems impossible, but you can think it through, and there is a way to do this. And matter of fact, I want to say, I know we only have a certain limited time here, but I want to say very emphatically something that I can prove, I'm sure, outside of this, and I want you to sort of keep it in your mind. That I think that a genuine rational breakthrough in the study of near-death experiences has already occurred, and that if we prepare people with these two objectives in mind, just putting a new logic in there and some, opening up some new mental faculties. Then, just by chance, over the years, somebody who's been through that procedure will happen to have a near-death experience. And my conjecture is that when they do, it will ameliorate or what we call the ineffability problem, right? That when people go into a near-death experience with these new logical principles on board, I conjectured, and now I would say assert, that this will give people entirely new means of investigating and thinking rationally about the afterlife question. Incidentally, the reason I say it with this confidence is I've been waiting for, I guess, 20-something years for this to come to pass, because I've taught my new logic continuously since 1969 and built it up. Initially as a philosophy professor, then as a medical doctor, and so on. And so I was just kind of waiting for somebody who's been through this program to have a near-death experience, and on October 15th, to my delight, I found out that this guy did. And I had about 6, 7, 8 years before, I had taught this man who is incidentally is a distinguished scientist and also artist, and he's elderly now. And so I taught him the system of logic. Then on October the 15th, he called me and told me that he had developed H1N1 flu some months before, and it was a terrible ordeal. He was in the hospital for 60 days, developed gangrene in one of his legs, lost his leg. But during this process of recovery, had 3 different near-death experiences. So, I was interested in the near-death experience aspect of this, was why my friend called me. So I was just listening to this experience, and his voice was very weak. As you can imagine, a person who'd been through that sort of ordeal. But suddenly it was like his voice got clear, and it was like excited, and it was like an emotional positivity. And Raymond, he said, when I was over there in that state, he said, I realized this. It's right, he said, in order to understand or comprehend, he said, the connection between this world and that other world, that you've got to take the unintelligibility axis, is how we put it, into account. And so what I can positively assert now is that we can actually interact with the near-death experience. We can get a handle on it by preparing our minds to think about not just near-death experiences, but a lot of different things in an entirely new way. So what I'm getting at here is I think that we have made a genuine breakthrough in the rational investigation of life after death. It's going to take time to assimilate. And perhaps the main reason is most people who get interested in this near-death question and fascinated in the near-death question, what they are interested in is narratives, right? Like what they want to hear is stories. When I put myself in that category, I've heard thousands of these things. I can't wait to hear the next one. But Plato, in the Phaedo and elsewhere, pointed out, and he said, first of all, you've got to have a narrative. He said, even to get conversation about this subject started, you've got to have some sort of story or narrative account, story to go with it. And he said, but in effect, even if you had 1 billion stories, it wouldn't add up to proof of life after death. You've got to have some sort of concepts to link the stories or the narratives to this notion of an afterlife. And what we've done in the last 100 years ago, that I think is an invalid procedure in my opinion, is that we rush into this And you say, oh, how can we investigate this? Aha, the scientific method, right? Without going through what I think is the first step is to say, not, oh, let's apply the scientific method to it, but rather, first question is, what method might we be able to apply to it? See, and that's where I am still stuck at this first point, and I think that's the breakthrough point. So, one thing I've been thinking about a lot lately is that, contrary to the feeling I've had all my life up until the last few years, I always assumed that there never will be a rational breakthrough in the investigation of the afterlife. But now I think I was wrong. I do. I think that we have new ways of looking at this. What I'd also say is that in my opinion, and I can prove this to the satisfaction of friends of mine who are logicians and professors, but I've got about 14 of the most brilliant people on YouTube evaluate this, and they all agree that, that it does seem to be true that we can actually reshape our own minds to think about this in an entirely new way. And that what that boils down to is that the rational investigation of life after death is no longer a logical or rational problem. It is now entirely a psychological problem. And the psychological problem is whether people are going to be able to overcome their sort of ingrained antipathy to this notion of the unintelligible, or things that don't make sense. And I'm not going to go up much more into that, except that to say that this is where the action is, in my opinion, that we now know new ways actually to fit our own mind more appropriately to this question. And this will eventually come to light. You can keep checking my website and so on. I'm going to publish this pretty soon. So. At the same time, I know some people are not interested in a rational proof of an afterlife, and because they've had an experience and so on. But some people are. And I think that we have a new way, I think, to help them in that capacity. Now, saying that, I think my conscience says that I really should divulge to you what I think about the afterlife. And I will say, as I said before, that to me this has always been a very highly counterintuitive notion. To somebody who was born in Georgia, and essentially, when I was a kid, all of our friends were Jewish, essentially, because my dad was an atheist. He was practicing as a surgeon in Macon, Georgia, which is a town that literally has a church on every corner. So you can imagine that the Christian doctors in town, who is this guy? Whereas the Jewish physicians in town said, hey, right on, it's time. So, when I was a kid, the only religious people I knew really were these Jewish friends of ours. And so I still just, to me, the notion of an afterlife is highly counterintuitive. But I am forced, and literally I will stutter or just to get these words out. It's still hard for me to do it. But what I'm going to say is, yeah, there is life after death, to my real surprise. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the considerations that have brought this to my attention. First of all, as with many philosophical debates, or debates like this that go on and on and on, the way to proceed in moving the debate forward is to get outside of the framework of the debate. Because what you'll find is that if a debate goes on interminably with no resolution, that what you should start looking at is not the things upon which the parties apparently disagree, but rather what you have to look at is the principles that they agree on without realizing it, right? That they take for granted. And that's where the problem is, and that's exactly what it is in the afterlife question. And the way we are taught to debate this, the way that arose in ancient Greece to debate this, is the same format you see on the talk shows today. Right? If you go back to Plato, for example, he talked about these near-death experiences, and you can tell that he took it seriously as an indicator of the afterlife. Meanwhile, his rough contemporary, Democritus, had a different take. Now, if you look at this thing right here, and you go by your common sense, it looks like this is an unbroken continuum, right? That there's no breaks in this. But basically, what Democritus did was that he started with two concepts. One is the concept that a geometrical point has no dimensions. We all know that. Then the other was the concept that two things can touch each other. And I won't go into the details of this argument, except to say that how it pans out is that he realized from that point that contrary to our sense perception that this is unbroken, this is actually made up of minute little bits that are escape the senses because they're too small to see. And he called them atoms, right? And so Democritus was the founder of the atomic theory. And in his writings about this, we don't have Democritus in his entirety. Plato had a school. Today we call it the university system. But therefore his works were passed on. Democritus didn't have a school, so his works got broken up. We only have them in fragments. But basically what he said was that he said, these near-death experiences, it's not the afterlife, he said. It's just the residual biological activity in the body. He said, there's no such thing as a moment of death, he said. And isn't it interesting that that same unproductive controversy continues on the talk shows? You see the guy who's kind of benign says, yes, it's real. And then the other guy says, oh, this is just brain damage or whatever. The same argument form. And we can't solve the problem within that standard framework of debate. That's the fact. Well, where I got to thinking that this is real is a few years ago, I was met a really nice man who was a graphic artist, very talented graphic artist, very nice man. And he told me about his near-death experience in which he had been in this car crash in which his wife was instantly killed and one of his sons was killed. And then one child lived, and he lost a leg, and he had this just terrible ordeal, and he had a profound near-death experience. So he was telling me about this, and he said, I'm kind of writing it up. And I encouraged him to do that because as a psychiatrist I know, an artist processes things like that. So in August, about 4 years ago, he sent me this manuscript, which by the way is terrific. And then about 2 weeks later, he called and he said, you know, I'm getting ready to publish this, and I was thinking, I've really got to mention the name of the trauma surgeon who saved my life, in this book. But he hadn't told the doctor, as typically happens. People don't tell the doctor. So he called up the doctor, I believe invited him to lunch. And when the doctor came, told him the story, and he said, the doctor became very solemn and said, well, I've never told anybody this, but that night you came into the hospital, I knew you weren't going to die because I talked to your wife in the in the operating room, the dead wife, by the way. And then as this went further, it turned out that the scrub nurse in the procedure had also sensed the wife there in the room. And then there's others, I have many others of that same pattern where the physicians actually interact with the patient's experience in some way. And really, I give up. I mean, I am a true disciple of Pyrrho, who was the founder of the skeptical movement. And if you know about Pyrrho, you know that these people who call themselves skeptics are not skeptics at all. They don't even know what the word means. What skepticism is, as articulated by Pyrrho, is the procedure whereby you avoid drawing conclusions. It's very plain in the early skeptical writings. So somebody who says something to you like, oh, I'm a skeptic about these near-death experiences. I think it's just the chemistry of the brain. Well, you unpack what they just said is, well, I'm a person who doesn't draw conclusions, and my conclusion is such and such. It's a self-contradiction. So the people who style themselves skeptics show themselves rather to be, frankly, ignorant. Well, to sort of close here, I sense, and I'm very careful about this because I think, as several have indicated here, I think we are in an entirely new era of thought that's emerging in this. And I think the whole debate about rational inquiry to the afterlife that we have been carrying on for about 2,400 years now, that's about to be upended. And I think that we're going to open into a whole new world of consciousness through these things. And I am dubious. I hear one time this really wonderful man who's, right after my book, Life After Life, came out, he took me out to his factory in the Midwest, and he said, you know, all my life I've been interested in this afterlife question. And he said, so Raymond, he said, I tell you what, I'll give you like an impossible amount of money for me, this fortune. And you set up this research to do this, to produce a scientific proof of an afterlife. And I said, Mac, you know, science is not the method to prove an afterlife. But the reason Mac wanted to do it was inherent interest, but also he thought, well, if we could just prove the afterlife, then everything would be fun, we would all love each other, we'd all be hugging all the time, life would be a perpetual New Age retreat. Right? And is that true? I hope that's true, because I think we're getting to the point now where we will have a rational breakthrough. So now these things that Matt was saying sort of come to my mind, and I'm still dubious about it. You know, all these people that go through these near-death experiences, I guess the most remarkable thing that struck me about the thousands of people I've talked with, and from the point of view of a psychiatrist, is that very early in my psychiatry career, I learned a very startling fact. And that is that everybody seems to be chasing something. You know, some people chase power or fame or money or whatever. I've never been interested in power. I've tried actively to avoid fame and have been indifferent to money. However, now at the age of 72, with a 15-year-old and a 17-year-old, I got to admit, I wish I thought more about that part of things. But the point is, what was so remarkable about, to me, that was emerging in my psychiatry practice, was that everybody had they were chasing something. So with this wonderful insight, I hurried to my wonderful psychiatric supervisor, John Butler. I said, John, it's like, I don't get it. All of these patients that I have, it's like everybody's chasing something. It's like, I just don't get it. I've never chased anything. So John looked at me with a smile and he said, Raymond, how old were you when you finished your second doctoral degree? And I said, 31. And now I realized, oh my God, I've been chasing knowledge all my life. I spent my whole life with my nose in a book. Never had any involvement with the feeling side of life at all. And so I got to say then that, therefore, I'm really humbled and upset and flustered in the past few months on this, because I guess I'm at a point in my life where I've got to acknowledge that there's an afterlife, but I don't really have the emotional equipment for it. I just, I'm 72 years old. I look around the room, I see some people my age, and I see a lot of people who are very young compared to me. So when I say to you, to the young ones are going to hear what I say in an entirely different way from as it will be heard by people of my age, and that is that I am ready to go. It's the neat thing about this phase of life is that it so wonderfully concentrates your awareness of why you're here. And for me, it's two reasons. My 17-and-a-half-year-old, almost 18-year-old son, Carter, adopted at birth, Mexican-American by heritage, and my 15-year-old daughter, Carol Ann, Blackfeet Indian from Montana by heritage. Both of them, adopted at birth. I've got two wonderful sons who are grown, 45, 40, and 42, a medical doctor and an expert in Spanish linguistics. And I've got a wonderful grandson. But they're on their own. My grandson has his parents. My grown sons are doing well. And so it's so neat that at this point of life, I am so focused on why I'm here. And that's to take care of these two kids. And I pray to God all the time that God, as soon as I can see that they are getting ready to leave and to make that break, I want out of here. And it may sound depressing if you're young, but I'm trying to impart a positive message here, because you'll see most of you when you get to be 72, that it's like you really you confront mortality and you get accepting of it, right? It's part of the process, right? First times when I was doing geriatric psychiatry, I heard what I'm saying now from some of my patients. I had a lot of Alzheimer's patients, but I also had a lot of cognitively sharp elderly people who were just there for a situational depression or stress or whatever. And I heard this all the time. I just can't wait to go. And so I went. The first time I heard it, I went to, again, my supervisor, John Buckner. And I said, John, it's amazing. It's like, got this man, he's really depressed. It's like, he's saying that he's ready to go. And he said, is he seem sad? No. Well, how's his appetite? Fine. Is he sleeping all right? Yeah. And he said, Raymond, he said, that's not depression. That is the normal encounter with the age. As you can learn, as I saw it when I was a kid, 18-year-old, and writing as a Plato, specifically the Phaedo, who made this very point that you reach this point and it's just like, I feel like I'm the Saturn V, right? It's like, remember before the Saturn V blasted off, that all these cables would start coming off, right? And that's the phase in my life that I am in now. I can't wait to get started. I want to get the kids accommodated first. Well, anyway, thank you. It's been delightful to be with you, and I want to emphasize here at the end, too, is I don't know much of anything. And I'm not trying to convince anybody else of anything, but to the degree that my thoughts and reflections on this are helpful to you, and that's a good thing for me. So thanks a lot.